This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means. It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop early holiday deals now.
You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
All right, hello again, listeners. You're listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo, and today we've got a topic that is the bread and butter of the podcast. And I'm joined by Luce Tomlin-Brenner, recurring guest. Hey, Luce.
Hello. Thank you for having me back to talk about my favorite topic.
Yeah, and of course the topic today is, we're calling it Horny Horror for the alliteration, also called erotic horror.
And Horno.
Horno.
Which is what I like to call it, that disgusts everybody.
That's nasty.
I know, it does sound so disgusting. That's why I like it.
So, Luce, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the thing, who are you? What do you do?
I am a comedian, DIY filmmaker, and the creator and host of the year-round Halloween history and storytelling podcast, It's Always Halloween, which is not a film podcast per se, although there definitely are film topics that we talk about. And I do have an episode on the history of slasher films, which I take back to all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, and talk about the ways in which the Colosseums and gladiator fights and the bloodlust that people had in that time can be directly connected to horror films now. So I like to explore history going back as far as I can and connect it to our modern horror and Halloween iconography.
Amazing. And It's Always Halloween is a great podcast.
Thank you.
If you like Girls, Guts, and Giallo, you should listen to It's Always Halloween. I mean, very different podcasts, but
they are different, but I do think they're like sister podcasts in a way, because we're both so interested in history and wondering where things come from and exploring kind of the unknown and what people aren't talking about as much. Mine is for all listeners. We do have some of our episodes are taught like in school, which I really like a lot, but that doesn't make it corny.
I love that.
Thank you. Yeah, I try to toe the line because I do work with kids a lot in my real life, and I wanted to make work that they could enjoy and learn from that wasn't stupid and didn't talk down to them. So I talk for every person, a way to learn about things and discuss topics that aren't really discussed that often. Like, I don't think kids really get the opportunity to talk about dark things because it's thought of as like depressing or inappropriate. And I really like discussing inappropriate things, as per our topic that we will get into today, because I'm not a G-rated person in general. But I do think it's important for people of all ages to have access to difficult topics.
Yeah, I feel like kids don't really get. I was just rewatching Creepshow, and obviously I love that movie too. And obviously it's a movie that's for adults, but the first time I saw it, I was like 12.
Same.
And I feel like it's something that's it was made for adults, but it was also made with like a younger audience in mind. And that's something I really appreciate about that movie, is that it's not like stupid. It's for a range of ages. And
exactly.
I feel like kids used to have movies that didn't talk down to them, that could be enjoyed by adults as well, and had really like beautiful practical effects and artistry. And that was some of my first introduction to horror. And something like Creepshow is really great because it is scary, but it's also like not funny. Super over the top. Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah,
and it's not like
campy.
It's campy. It's not like, and it's not like sexually violent, right? So it's good for kids. So
yeah, that's the thing. Kids need to. It's not a bad thing for kids to be scared. They need to not be in danger in their real lives, but like, scares are part of growing into adulthood, is dealing with things that feel complicated, and you need to process them and learn how to process them. If you don't ever get confronted with difficult material, how will you ever grow? How will you ever be able to handle the adult world of nonstop terror every day?
So true. And today's topic is not a very kid-friendly topic. But
no, but the kids, the later teens need a little bit more of it, because I am very worried about the puritanification of the Gen Z, and the like of the people that end up talking on Twitter about being scared of Sabrina Carpenter. I need these people to see more sexual horror movies.
Totally. At the same time, like, it's hard for me to tell because these articles come out, right, that are like, Gen Z doesn't want sex in films. And it's like, I can't tell how much of that is like fear mongering, like how they used to do about millennials.
Exactly. Well, because some of those, like that main article that like keeps going around every year, if you look at it, the people they're interviewing are like 12 to 15 or 12 to 16. And I'm like, I think it's okay if middle schoolers don't want sex in movies. They're not probably having sex yet. Their focus should be on other things.
Totally.
They probably just want to get onto volleyball or whatever the fuck, like.
Yeah.
I don't know why what the rest of us want has anything to do with like what somebody who is currently obsessed with learning TikTok dances. Not to denigrate that. Like, that's what you should be doing. If I had all the time in the world and no responsibilities, I'd probably be learning TikTok dances also. But like, their lives are very different from the rest of our lives. So
yeah, so I can't tell how much of
culture.
I can't tell how much of it is fear mongering and how much of it is like something we actually have to be worried about, because then we do get the posts like, I'm 17 and I'm terrified of Sabrina Carpenter. Like we do. There are, which I'm like, are you a psyop?
Right. Well, that's the other thing. We also never know what the people that you're interacting with online, or even the ages that they say they are.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I do think some of it is like, I think we have less sex in movies than ever. And I think that that's really indicative of the kind of culture that we're in. And at the same time, I think some of this is like fear mongering.
Overblown.
Yeah, exactly. So today's topic: horny horror, erotic horror. Why is horror horny? And what are some examples of erotic horror? We're working towards a canon of horny horror here. So first, right off the bat, Luce, what about horror specifically is horny?
Well, so much of it has to do with the body. And consuming flesh, tearing at flesh, pulling flesh towards you. I mean, it is the most visceral of, it's basically, you've got porn and horror have to do with like so much visceral, gooey body things that they just overlap so seamlessly to me. you're probably familiar with this article, Gender, Genre, and Excess by Linda Williams. She talks about horror and porn and melodrama as all kind of existing within the same world because of they're all excessive and they're all thought of as less than genres, and they're all genres that like appeal to women, but people don't think that they appeal to women because like women's, interest are usually like denigrated, and what women find sexy isn't considered as often. But that's is such an interesting article. I really recommend it. And she talks about how the excessiveness of all of these genres make them really titillating and really exciting because they lift us kind of out of what our day-to-day lives are like, but are kind of what we wish our lives could be like, living at this like height of need, desire, so much so that you're sort of pushed towards violence. I mean, I don't know, when I'm like really craving somebody, I have this feeling of like I want to rip and tear and bite your skin, and like seeing that actually playing out in a horror movie, I'm like, oh yes, I can't necessarily, you love lesbian vampires, you are the lesbian vampire. You can't necessarily rip someone's throat out, but you can like play as much as close to possible as doing that. And it's so fun to actually see it happening in a movie, right? Like it feels like, yeah, I don't want to murder to destroy lives. I want to like murder for us both to come.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's an element of that in good horny horror. I think there's definitely horror with sexual violence in it that is coming from a not sexy place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of the rape revenge genre films would be considered horror, but are not necessarily erotic or horny. Just because something has sex or sexuality in it doesn't necessarily make it part of the horny horror canon. I would say, I mean, that's a great reference, the Linda Williams piece. And I would say also, if something exemplifies this kind of Georges Bataille idea of the combining of the sex drive and the death drive, that to me is what makes something an erotic horror film.
And we talked about that on our very first episode together, the Crash, David Cronenberg.
Yeah.
That we did, like, I think 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, we definitely have to talk about David Cronenberg in this episode.
So I think David Cronenberg was sort of my way into finding out that horror could be horny, because I grew up more seeing the horror comedy stuff like, Creepshow or Stephen King, slashers, like the teen slasher cycle of the 90s was very much my thing. And so a lot of the slashers, I had like, of course, tons of tits. And as like a baby queer girl, I definitely was like, ooh, I love tits. But, there wasn't a lot in there that made it super sexual. And then when I studied, I majored in women's studies and film in college, and so much of the focus in the 2000s and the third wave of feminism was that like sexualized women in horror was bad. And so I was kind of like taught to look at those types of films through a lens of like, this hurts women. And it took me through like my late 20s and then into my 30s to be like, oh, actually, there is this whole erotic, beautiful side to it. And the monstrous feminine actually being very empowering, and not reading it through kind of the basic, like, this hurts women, sort of like the first reading that I think it gets a lot.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Get softer, smoother, and more even-toned skin after just one use with the new Gentle Exfoliating line from Cetaphil. Formulated with a unique triple acid blend that promotes surface skin cell renewal, these gentle chemical exfoliators remove dead skin cells and refine skin's texture while hydrating, resulting in softer, smoother, more even-looking skin. Shop the new Cetaphil Gentle Exfoliating line in the face and body aisles at your local Target store or online at Cetaphil.com.
Yeah, and I mean, the Monstrous Feminine, Barbara Creed's Monstrous Feminine, the original text, a great deal of it is about how these male filmmakers, like, pathologize the female body. But her new book, The Return of the Monstrous Feminine, is all about new wave feminist horror cinema. And she talks about things like Julia DeSarno's films and Coralie Farjah films, something like Lure she talks about, and a lot of her analysis is it's a psychoanalytic analysis, so she uses a lot of Freud, and there is this discussion of the connection between the sex drive and the death drive, and how we come from the void and we return to the void, and sex is our kind of way of going back to that void that we come from and return to. It's this kind of like almost liminal space where we can experience that.
Well, and I love that so much. And coming from my background with Halloween history and enthusiasm, like I always talk about how this time of year when the veil is getting the thinnest, because that's what's happening right on Halloween nights. The veil between the worlds of the living and the dead is the absolute thinnest. And I do find that to be like very similarly engaging and thrilling to sort of feel like, oh, this night you could almost walk around one dark corner and who knows like what you could see or what you would fall into, like that, the tempting the void, and not in like a suicidal way, but in like a exciting way, I do feel like is extremely erotic and exciting. And I love that what you just said, and like, yeah, that totally, because when you're like really in the throes of like the best sex and there's like and there's just no thoughts, it's just like, oh my God, is this what yeah, just the pleasure of emptiness is so amazing.
Totally.
The pleasure of the void, it's really thrilling to think about.
And in kink, we play with fear, and fear and arousal are so deeply connected. I mean, there's that Tracy Emin sculpture that I'm constantly referencing, which is just a neon sign that says "My cunt is wet with fear." And
it's so good. We both need that in our apartments.
Totally. Just on a huge on a wall. And those feelings are so connected. And I always say, like, I have trouble at haunted houses because I just get horny in them. Like, I just want when the people jump out and scare me, I'm like, oh my God, are you going to have your way with me? Like,
yeah, are we going to kiss? Do you want to kiss? Can you shove me up against the wall?
Right.
I know. I'm like, I can't do the blackout ones where they're like, we'll touch you. And I'm like, don't tempt me. I'm going to get thrown out for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, my girlfriend always jokes about, like, when we first met, we went to Idlewild and it was like dark, empty woods all around this cabin that we were in. And I kept like joking with her, and I was like, wouldn't it just be so awful if there was a killer in the woods? And I was saying it like it was a horny thing. And it's just like there's something about like being menaced or stalked that's just like so erotic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that is what is very exciting about a lot of these films. And we're going to get into it. But I do like that's what I love about Giallo films is like so much of the stalking, the watching. I think you and I have talked about this before, or I've listened to you talk to other people about it and assumed I was in the room with you during the conversation. But it's that if you are a voyeur or an exhibitionist at all, I also think that like horror is very exciting because so much of and I want to say like this is something that Brian De Palma has either talked about or has just been written about his work so much, but like yeah, how titillating it is to be the voyeur and like when it crosses over from being like exciting to then going almost too far and where is that line, and he's like constantly exploring that in his work. And I do feel like a lot of successful erotic horror is sort of like exploring that, like, oh, you like to watch, like, what about this, what about this, is this too much, oh, you don't like this now. And it sort of taunts you, which I also find like taunting to be very sexy.
Yeah.
So yeah, especially just that like when you're put in the position of the killer and you're like, I'm behind a bush watching somebody who doesn't know that I'm watching them. Like definitely there's a read on that is less favorable. But yeah, as a queer woman who is attracted to women, there is like a kinky aspect of that.
Yeah. I mean, of course, some people might listen to this and think we're like out of our minds, but they're.
I mean, I hope by the time that they get to this episode, they know that we're freaks already.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to listen to our Rosemary's Baby piss play episode to really see our depths of depravity.
So we are kind of just roughly working towards a canon of horny horror in this episode. This is not completionist by any means. This topic is huge, right? I mean, we were both talking about before we started recording, we were like intimidated because this is such a gigantic topic and a topic that's so important to both of us that we were like, oh my God, I hope we're going to do it justice, because erotic horror, I mean, the erotic horror is the theme on my Patreon right now, the theme of my screenings and episodes. And picking like a canon of erotic horror to screen for my patrons was really difficult. I can see that. There's so much out there, and picking like the standout films was just really, really difficult. So I mean,
this is like a book series, like we're so like this will be no way totally comprehensive, and we're at the end of the Halloween season, so both of us are down to like our last few brain cells that we're sharing.
Yeah, I feel like we're just passing a brain cell back and forth in this episode.
Yeah, and going like, yeah, so horny, yes.
So I kind of started with my series in the 70s, but I thought in this episode we could talk a little bit about older horror films. I'm not super familiar. This is a gap in my knowledge. Because I study, exploitation film and beyond. So I'm not super familiar with pre-code horror. But I'm going to guess that there's a lot of subtext in there, like in something like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, or Vampire from 1932. I love Vampire because it's the first really Carmilla adaptation. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of subtext in that film. I was going to ask you, Luce, if something like a really early horror film like Todd Browning's Dracula from 1931, would you consider that an erotic horror film, or something like The Black Cat from 1934?
The Black Cat is interesting because that has like the prolonged kind of torture scene in it at the end.
Yes.
And it really disturbed audiences at the time. It was like the most violent sexual movie that mainstream audiences had seen, and it was extremely controversial. So it's the same thing, when we talk about things that are scary, right? Because people will be like, oh, I don't like old movies, they're not scary. And you have to think about it at the time, and that being like the scariest thing that anybody had ever seen. And if you kind of have to put yourself in the headspace of that time period, right? And it's a very sadistic film, about kidnapping and like kind of mad science work. And I think a lot of that stuff is pretty sexy if you're interested in anything that has like some sadistic play in it. But again, it's so sort of, you don't see very much. It's still, even though it was so violent and sexual for the time, it's it's hard for it, I think, to be titillating now unless you really, like, get yourself in that imaginary space of, like, this is somebody that's tied up, they're being whipped, they're being experimented on, and so I do think there is a level of eroticism that you can get to with that story.
Yeah, and with something like Dracula, where the story is kind of inherently erotic.
Yes, yeah. I don't know if there's, I mean, Bela Lugosi was seen as such a sex symbol after this movie, so it definitely was working on women at the time. Um, I don't know if, like, this is a film that does much for me. But yes, as you stated, like, Carmilla was written, what, like 18 years before Dracula, and is like a much more sensual book and feels a lot more, it feels like obviously Dracula is like very inspired by it. So I think there definitely are elements to it, but I think that the hammer is when, they start to kind of dig into the sexual themes that were maybe just winked at in like the 30s films. And they're like, what if we did this a lot more overtly?
Right. And then there's something like a movie like Al Rayun, which I actually haven't seen.
I haven't seen that one either.
But it's from 1929, directed by Richard Oswald, and it sounds promising for eroticism. A scientist interested in the laws of heredity impregnates a prostitute in a laboratory with the semen of a hanged murderer. The prostitute conceives a female child who has no concept of love, whom the professor adopts. The girl, Al Rayun, suffers from obsessive sexuality and perverse relationships throughout her life. She learns of her unnatural origins, and she avenges herself against the professor. Love
wow.
her.
Yeah, that has like a Poor Things element to it.
Yeah, it does. And Bride of Frankenstein sort of themes going on there.
Yeah, and just like these ideas that people are kind of playing with the family, right? Because like we're not quite 10 years into women having the right to vote. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff sort of happening, with the first wave of like women's right, like feminism and women's rights. And like, you can already see the fear that is coming up in film around women having more agency, and this idea that like, oh, what if women don't need to get married? What if women can have sex without men? And here it's like, oh yeah, of course, if a woman is purely interested in sex, they'll be completely like a monster, and their whole life will be ruined. And I do think that that's, I don't know, obviously like that's culturally what's happening in a lot of these films. There's like the fear of the female sexual agency. But to me, that fear, like men being afraid of that, is really hot. Like,
yeah, totally.
I'm like, yeah, I am fucking feral. You should be scared of me. My sexuality will absolutely consume and destroy you.
Yeah, and that's something we see again in something like Cat People, the Jacques Tourneur 1942 version, of course, which is definitely erotic horror.
Yes. And yeah, there's, people talk a lot about the Paul Schrader one from the 80s, which of course is more like traditionally modern sexy, but I don't know. I think there's something really interesting about I think the early one also has this, because she is not American. And so she's like very exoticized for her, like her accent and coming from like a place that the main male character isn't familiar with. And he loves that, but it scares him. And seeing how like his interest in her, actually turns her into an animal, like, That's, I don't know, very relatable, I think. And people were supposed to be scared of her, but now, yeah, watching it again, I'm like, yes, our sexual cat hero, please.
Yeah, and people were scared of her, but at the same time, there was that push and pull between her beauty and the terror of the cat person, which I think is a hallmark of erotic horror. There's the push and pull between the fear and the eroticism. And
she had that pretty privilege.
Oh God.
I'm saying too many buzzwords on this episode. We're gonna get flagged by all the wrong people.
But yeah, I think that's, to me, that would be like one of the big hallmarks of erotic horror, is there's got to be the push and pull between disgust and attraction. And in something like Cat People, we get that with the beautiful woman turning into a monstrous cat person. There's the disgust and the attraction there. But I feel like horror doesn't really get erotic until the 1960s.
Well, right, because it's, in the 32, 33 is when the Hays Code goes into effect, and then it's not lifted until like 64. And so we have like 30 years that are like ripped away from our sexual imagination, and everything has to be so overly coded, or like a lot of like Hitchcock, you're like, I guess this is sexy because he's a perv and he's trying his best to like get around stuff. But like eroticism was just so much, I don't know, a lot more difficult to come by. But yeah, I do think that's why a lot of the pre-code stuff has a lot more sensuality to it, even though it's older. But yes, getting to the 60s, once you're allowed to have boobs, it makes a big difference.
Such a big difference. And I'm thinking specifically of like Italian 60s cinema, like Mario Bava's Whip in the Body, which I think is a standout erotic horror, which is about a woman kind of driven crazy by her obsession with a man who would whip her sexually, and after he dies, his ghost kind of like haunts her and comes to her and whips her in the night. And it's about a lot about her insanity there, but there's like, of course, those erotic elements. Or something like The Horrible Dr. Hickok, directed by Ricardo Freda from 1964, about a necrophile. And there's a lot of erotic scenes of the doctor preying on his dead female patients. Or something like Castle of Blood from 1964, which is an early lesbian vampire film. So these like 60s, I mean, the Italians, they're always
yeah, they were a lot more.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, they had a lot more. And of course the Hays Code didn't affect, they were dealing with their own level of like fascism and things, and they didn't quite have to contend with the same level of censorship that we did. But I do think we've talked about this, I think, on maybe our Baba Yaga episode that I think we did for It's Always Halloween. But so many of these Italian filmmakers were like feminists and anarchists, and like they were really involved in this like underground scene that involved a lot of like sexual liberation and gay and lesbian artists. It wasn't as divided as our country was, and it was a lot less corporate to be a filmmaker at that time. It was more revolutionary, so I think they explored a lot of those themes. They went very easily hand in hand.
Yeah, and these three movies that I'm thinking of too are all gothics. So the gothic, right, is so traditionally erotic. Like there's again that disgust and attraction. There's dealing with anything taboo sexually. is part of the Gothic, like incest or necrophilia or BDSM. So these Italian Gothics are, kind of ripe for this erotic horror.
And I honestly think that the castles and the darkness and candles and the lush fabrics, I mean, we didn't really talk about any of that yet, and that's in so many of these movies, but like the set deck for these films, I think that really, when you see something that is like extremely lush in a horror film, and these Gothic horror films, they are like, that is very sexual. Moving, of course, there's a lot of sleazy ones that are fun as well. But like when something is just like, it looks soft, it looks rich, it looks like something you want to wrap yourself in, like the visual keys that beyond just the body are also like intensely horny,
Yeah, totally. The lushness of everything. And, yeah, I didn't even, when I was writing this list, I didn't even kind of realize that these 3 films were Gothics, but now talking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes complete sense. And I have a whole episode from a couple years ago about Gothic Giallo, if anybody is interested in that. That was one of my Halloween episodes. So if you want to hear more about the Gothic, check that out. Can you think of any like American 60s films that you would think of as erotic horror?
Let me look at my little list here. Yeah, I feel like all of mine are not American.
Which I think says a lot also.
Yeah, no, totally. Because, I don't think this film is especially sexy, but like one of the best Gothic horror films from that time period is definitely The Haunting.
Oh yeah.
By Robert Wise, based on the Shirley Jackson novel. And there's some really, interesting lesbian themes in there and psychosexual stuff as well.
Definitely psychosexual, but maybe not erotic.
Yes, exactly. And that's kind of what we're playing with here, where we're like, there are sexual elements in a lot of horror films, but they're not horny. Like I find Shirley Jackson's work to be extraordinarily gay, but I don't find it to be horny.
Yeah, The Haunting is a really good example of something that's like very psychosexual, but not necessarily erotic.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about like, and I would also think of like Hitchcock that way too, like very psychosexual, very perverse, but not necessarily erotic.
Yeah, people are so tormented in these films that it's not it goes beyond like, ooh, tormented, and it's more like, oh god, no, tormented.
Yeah, it's not the purpose. Like there's something like the whip in the body is meant to titillate the viewer. Whereas something like The Haunting or like a Hitchcock film like Rope has a lot of psychosexual elements. And it is titillating in a way because anything sexual is going to be titillating for human beings. But it doesn't have that push and pull of the disgust leading into the attraction or playing with the idea of fear being arousing. Like in The Whip in the Body, part of why she's so aroused is like this fear of this ghost coming to her in the night and whipping her. It plays with the arousal of fear, and something like The Haunting is more about like the neurosis of fear or the fear of your inner self.
And I wonder if it's just because, the politics around female sexuality in the 60s in America was so rank, like people talk about it being like the sexual revolution. And obviously, there were a lot of interesting things happen for the second wave of feminism and civil rights and gay and lesbian liberation. But that stuff was happening in like more of an underground level. And the sexual revolution as a whole is something that was really catered towards like mainstream white men and like their sexuality and their freedom to have sex the way that they want. And women, their partners were still kind of expected to sort of go along with it. Like, yes, birth control, you can have sex, but it's really still within the frameworks of like how men want to be having sex. And if the women were kind of taking agency and control, and that wasn't really still appreciated or desired, and certainly not in mainstream film. That was still very kind of demonized, where I think in Italian film they were much more interested in like what was going on in women's lives and like their sexuality. And it seems like there was a lot more understanding about how women were also prey, and like what and men were often the predators and what that looked like. And Sergio Martino explored that in a lot of his Giallo films, which I really love his work a lot. And he was very interested in like what women are kind of going through, and how their sexuality is often exploited by men, and like kind of the terror of that. Like when you were talking about sort of that push and pull, I was thinking about The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, and how I love it so much. So much of it is her being tormented by these memories of her ex who was abusive to her, but gave her like incredible sex that she loved, right? Like this hardcore BDSM sex. And she had this hard time separating that from the other kind of abuse that he gave her. And she can't stop thinking about the sex. And she can't stop thinking that maybe she's being stalked by this guy and she hates it, but she's interested in it. And maybe her life's in danger, but she really needs to have this sex. And it's like that right there is like exactly what we're, kind of exploring and talking about with the push pull of like the death drive. And I think that a movie like that comes from a deep interest in women's lives, which I really just don't see from male American filmmakers in the 1960s.
Or at least a deep interest in like women's sexual lives, or the way that women
or that they have their own sexual thoughts,
right,
and just the complexity of things that women experience, that they can enjoy rough sex. I mean, I think that's something we're still battling in America now, to be like, yes, women actually can like the large gangbangs.
Oh yeah, that discourse
that on Twitter. Sorry, bringing up Twitter drama on a podcast feels extraordinarily lame, but it's hard to not think about that at the same time, because it feels like we keep having these same conversations over and over again. And it's interesting to see some of these having already been explored, 60
totally
years ago.
Yeah, Giallo, since we're talking about Italian films, like we should just talk you've already started the conversation about Giallo, but something like Lucio Fulci's Lizard in a Woman's Skin from 1973, I feel like really exemplifies the eroticism of the genre, and the thing that you're talking about, Luce, of like specifically women's sexuality and women's eroticism, or even something that's about men's psychosexual hangups, like Hatchet for the Honeymoon. There's something so distinctly horny and erotic about the way that these films are made and the way that they deal with sexuality. Like, they are psychosexual, but they're also very erotic because they actually have sex scenes, and they have nudity, and they have there's a lot more going on than just like subtextual sexual neuroticism. There's actually like lived in sexuality that happens.
Right. You see women enjoying sex, also being interested in sex, even if the sex is scary or they're wrestling with it. They're having Lizard in a Woman's Skin, where she like has nightmares about sex and group sex, like, but is also very, like, compelled by it. Like, that is very, really progressive, and I think that's what makes it, like, very sexy is it's not just wielded as violence against women or that the titillation comes from seeing women uncomfortable. The titillation comes from the complexities of seeing a woman kind of grapple with how sex is both really wonderful and, like, kinda scary at the same time.
I feel like we can't talk about erotic horror without talking about the fathers of erotic horror, Jean Rollin and Jess Franco.
Absolutely. Two men who also were very involved in, like, pornography at the time and whose work was very, like, kinda blurred the lines in a way that I find very compelling and very inspiring, and I wish we honestly had more of that these days.
Yeah, so Jean Rollin, a French filmmaker who worked a lot in the fantastique genre, which I've been describing to my patrons as the intrusion of supernatural elements into everyday life and the characters and the viewer not knowing if those elements are actually supernatural or not.
Beautifully put. I love that.
Oh, thank you.
I think that really describes, like, the kinds of films that I love and that I ache for. I find that to be a very exciting place to sort of live.
Yeah, I love the fantastique genre. I love this idea of, like, is it a ghost or is this person just going crazy? You know, like I love that shit.
Oh yeah, a woman being driven to madness. That's my favorite.
Yeah.
That's my favorite genre.
Totally. So he's a French filmmaker. He, throughout his career, would direct pornography and use the money that he made from those films to fund his passion films, which I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
The way I would describe his films is they're like a very dreamy mix of erotica and horror, lots of sexuality and sex scenes and nudity, and the core of those films is erotic horror. It's that push and pull between eroticism and disgust and terror, and it's also a lament on the passage of time and the eternal nature of sexuality and love and romance, and that's kind of the core of a Jean Rollin film, is that erotic horror.
I completely agree. Sorry, I wanted to pause and see if you were going to say anything
else. Oh yeah,
else.
no problem.
But yeah, no, I also love the blending of, like, relationships in his films. Like, are they friends? Are they relatives? Are they lovers? Like,
yes,
the blending of romance is something I really relate to a lot as somebody who truly does not kind of understand the difference between, like, platonic and romantic love, or like what I don't totally see those lines clearly in my own relationships, and I love the way that that's blurred in his films as well. Like, they're supposed to be friends and yet they're drinking each other's blood and massaging each other and rolling around together.
Yeah, I mean, Jean Rollin famously is one of the, like, prolific lesbian vampire filmmakers.
Of course.
He made many lesbian vampire films. Some highlights for me are like Living Dead Girl, Lips of Blood, Shiver of the Vampires, Fascination. But I also love something like The Iron Rose, which is not.
I love that one.
Yeah, I love that one, which is not a lesbian vampire film, but it's this kind of really beautiful meditation on the erotic nature of death. And it's shot in a cemetery, and the two main characters at one point have sex in an ossuary, like on a pile of bones.
Yeah, my dream.
And he really ties together this idea of the sex drive and the death drive really, really beautifully, in this gorgeous like meditation on the passage of time and the nature of life and death itself.
Right. And how, I mean, yeah, you cannot separate sex from any of that. And there's so much like, I find like sort of melancholy to be sort of sexy too, which I feel like has been a difficult cross to bear in my life because I'm attracted to sad people. But I really like how his films feel very melancholic and like sort of I don't know, there's such different filmmakers, but there's sort of like a Charlie Kaufman-esque like feeling of like, what are we doing here? And like, is this what we should be doing with our time? Maybe we should be, more focused on the sensuality and being close with each other. And like, yes, this is really scary, but what if we just like leaned into it and we were less concerned with like the day to day? I don't know. I find that also as like a hedonist who like an anarchist, I'm like, I don't think we should be working at all. I think we should be living in seaside towns and drinking blood and fucking on bones. Like that's
yeah, honestly, preach. And there's also,
but then I'm like, was that something I was born with, or did I just watch all of these movies and then I was like, oh wait, this is the life I want to be living?
And there's also like a Proustian element to Jean Rollins films too, because there's this like idea of memory and a smell or a note of music or a face in a crowd, like recalling the past. And it's so romantic as well as erotic.
And dangerous, right? The idea of being lost in a past and something that's already happened, not moving forward. I mean, there's like a certain death in nostalgia as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously Jean Rollins' brother director, Jess Franco. Who,
what a weirdo.
Right, who made so many films.
I know. I felt like I'd seen a lot of his, and then I looked up his filmography on Letterboxd, and I was like, oh, I've only seen 17% of his films.
195 feature films.
Yeah, that's incredible. What a king.
Yeah. So he made so many, and a lot of them are like straight up porn. Yeah. And Jess Franco, like Jean Rollin, really blends the erotic with horror. Some films that stand out for me are She Killed in Ecstasy, Vampiros Lesbos, Lorna the Exorcist, The Female Vampire, The Marquis de Sade's Justine. Well,
he was very inspired by the Marquis de Sade.
Yes.
Like he adapted several films kind of based on his writing.
Yeah, he was a big fan.
And so that even the ones that weren't adapted, that is coursing through his work and his interest, and you can see the influence of the Marquis de Sade in, I think, everything that he does.
Who was like a progenitor of erotic horror.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love Female Vampire.
Me too.
Which she's essentially like sucking the life out of men through their dicks, which is like such an amazing way to think about doming men. Because I feel like I hear women talk about how like, blowjobs can't be erotic or they're always demeaning. And I'm like, no, not if you're You
Not
just
if
have
you're
to, like,
killing
flip the
them.
script a little bit. Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm sorry, have you ever blown a man? They're like they get so, like, weak and whimpery and pathetic. It's amazing. Like, they're absolutely useless afterwards. It's, like, the most powerful experience. Like,
I
just
just wish
turn
there
them
was
into
a
a sack of
better
bones.
word for it than blowjob because it really makes it sound like work.
That's true.
Which, like,
Hmm.
to be fair, for some of us, it does feel like that. But
Yeah,
if
I
you
mean, I
like
like to
it,
think of it as the good work, just like filmmaking
the
and
good work.
podcasting, you love what you do, you're not working a day in your life. Happy to put in a little time to see a man absolutely decimated by my skills.
Beautiful. I mean, that's I feel like that's one of those things where it's like, oh, are you topping? If you're like, who's topping and who's bottoming in that situation? And it's like, that's all happening in the mind, baby.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. If I'm involved, it's stopping. Like, doesn't matter what position it is. It depends on like how much you absolutely turn weak in the knees for me.
So Jess Franco is very concerned with the intersection between sex and violence. That's a big thing for him, and how violence and sexuality can look the same visually. And how they can bleed into each other, and how there's often very little difference between the two. I would say that that's really what characterizes Jess Franco's work: the eroticism of violence, the fetishism
I love
of violence.
That he like moved from Spain to France because he couldn't make the level of violent sexual films he wanted to make in Spain.
Yes.
And so he's like, France is the place that will welcome me in. Just like Roland, who we were just talking about.
Well, that's actually
so fun.
That's kind of what happened with another filmmaker I have on this list, Valerian Borowczyk.
I don't know as much about their work.
Yeah, so he was a Polish filmmaker who started as like an avant-garde animator in Poland and moves to France in order to be able to make erotic films. And he isn't strictly erotic horror. Like, he also made the famous nunsploitation film Behind Convent Walls. But two of his most famous films, La Bête and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne, are like standout erotic horror films. And they're very surreal, non-linear films. I would say that his erotic films are very much characterized by like the touchability of the objects and the people in the frames. Definitely, if you haven't seen it, Luce, definitely watch The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne.
Yeah, I was just looking it up and it looks beautiful.
It's gorgeous.
Also, I just love the description. In 19th century London, a sex maniac sneaks into the engagement party of Dr. Henry Jekyll and Miss Fanny Osborne, turning the event into a nightmarish whirlpool of murder and debauchery.
It's so good. And yeah,
there's not enough sex maniacs anymore.
I know.
Too many sex pests, not enough sex maniacs.
As a nymphomaniac.
Yeah, I'd like to see my people represented. I'd like to see them ruining more heterosexual wedding parties.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this Borowczyk is really concerned again. I mean, I think another thing that we're finding as we discuss this genre or this category of horror films is like the sexual lives of women are really important to erotic horror.
Absolutely. And like, yeah, these aren't all films that just involve women, but the fact that they are also elevated to being persons of interest when it comes to the erotic is what makes it more exciting. Because then otherwise you really are think that's when you're getting into just the fantasies of male violence where the violence is sexualized, not the violence is sexual, if that makes sense. Like, because it can't be if you're just looking at things very one-sided and it's like the violation is what's hot and not like the sexual element of it. I don't know. I don't feel like I'm explaining it very well, but when you just involve it, when it's just like one-sided, I feel like it can't necessarily reach the heights of like full eroticism, like when our inner thoughts aren't even like involved at all.
Yeah, I feel like for me, another hallmark of erotic horror is there has to be an element of women's sexuality being, I don't know if elevated is the right word, or explored. Mm-hmm. Like Jean Rollin is so fascinated by women's sexuality. That's like a huge theme in his films. Barochik as well, like in La Bête and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Miss Osborne, is all about the repressed woman coming into her sexuality and destroying the man, and that is incredibly erotic, like you were talking about with your blowjobs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Anytime you get male destruction on board, oof. I mean, I will probably talk about this too, but I feel like Possession has a lot of eroticism as far as that's concerned as well, and comes from sort of like a male anxiety around sexuality.
Absolutely.
But as a woman watching it for the first time, I was like, no, this is really hot.
Yeah, totally. I would totally put Possession in the erotic horror category, the Andrei Zulawski movie. That's for sure. Anything with like monster fucking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is definitely erotic horror. And there's this anxiety about women's sexuality, and I feel like in everything that we're talking about, but at the same time, it's a recognition of how powerful women's sexuality is, even though there is that anxiety there.
Right. No, that's such a great point. And I think that's what's missing from like the slasher genre that got so much attention about being overly sexual, which I don't think a lot of those films are sexual. They might have like a clip of what is supposed to be sex, or they might have tits in it, but I don't think that makes a movie sexual necessarily. Yeah, that acknowledgement that women are or could be a threat due to their sexuality. I mean, great. That's how I want to be viewed. I like men seeing me as a threat. Like, it's when there's no thought that women have an internal sexuality that it's like, ugh. And I think that's a lot of like where we are right now with a lot of mainstream American film. I don't want to jump ahead, but yes, I think you said that very beautifully.
Well, and then there's also something like Ganja and Hess, Bill Gunn's film from 1973, which is about these germs from the stab of an ancient dagger, which turn these two lovers into immortal vampires. And that isn't so much about like the anxiety of women's sexuality per se, but this legacy of racial violence and the push and pull between the sexuality of the vampire and this fraught history that these two characters come from, which I feel like is also present in something like Candyman, which we can talk about when we talk about Clive Barker. But yeah, Ganja and Hess is also a very like romantic film that really captures why the vampire is so romantic and erotic. I mean, I love Ganja and Hess.
Absolutely. Well, the lifelong dedication to another person, mind, body,
Yes.
soul. Of course, that's like for eternity. Yeah, that's extremely sexual and has like a lot of like DS, implications to it as well. But yeah, I think Ganja and Hess is really and Candyman are very interesting too for the ways in which there's some exploration of like the over sexualization of the Black body by white people as well, and there's a reclamation of sexuality for, the main characters, and I think that's really kind of important because it aligns with what we were saying about, women having sexual agency and things being more erotic when it's from a more marginalized perspective and experience. Ganja and Hess is an incredible film. It is so layered. It's really, really brilliant. That's a movie that took many viewings, and lots of reading for me.
Well, and I feel like the Spike Lee remake, The Sweet Blood of Jesus, like part of why it's so unsuccessful is because it's not sexy and erotic.
Yeah. Yeah. Spike Lee doesn't really make erotic films well or like explore eroticism in a way that has ever interested me.
Yeah. I mean, Ganja and Hess, like you have to, at the core of that eroticism of that movie is the romance and that idea of dedicating yourself to someone forever. Well, we have to talk about David Cronenberg.
Yes, absolutely. I was gonna say real quick, that does make me think of The Hunger also, which
absolutely.
I think is such a sad, sexy film and has so much to do with like people just giving themselves over, using each other up in a way that's like deeply hot and tragic.
Well, when you said give yourself over, I thought about Rocky Horror Picture Show when the lyric give yourself over to absolute pleasure.
Absolute pleasure.
Would you consider Rocky Horror Picture Show an erotic horror film?
Absolutely. Actually, I think that's a really great that brings us back to what we started talking about in the beginning about things being accessible to the youth. I mean, that was one of the first really sexy movies I saw as like a teenager. And that was like very accessible because it was very funny and campy, over the top. It's a musical. I was a theater kid, very really appealed to me on all of those levels. But it did also like, I think I don't know when I saw it, I'm not sure if I was out yet. And so, but even if I was out to like, it would be to a few friends, and it was the early 2000s. So it was not safe really. And there was like such freedom in watching that. And it did make me feel like such an intense connection to my sexuality early on, 30 years after it was made. Um, so I think it's like, it's extremely erotic. It's like exploring bisexuality, gender fluidity, gender presentation, and the idea of being from another planet, like you're so different from everybody else. And again, you're like a threat. Your sexuality, your decadence, your hedonism is like a threat to like the moral, straight and narrow expectations of a capitalist society. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that that's definitely a super important erotic horror film.
A Creature of the Night, that's such a sexy song.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the way that's shot with the shadows and again, talking about set deck and costuming, like just very gauzy, velvet, sparkly. Everything in Rocky Horror is extremely textured. That's like a movie I've always, when you think about a movie you want to live in, that's a movie I'm like, oh my God, please put me inside of that movie. I want to touch everything.
Yeah. And everybody's hot. It's just like a very
insane fashion, tons of makeup.
Yeah. It's a
I really can't
one of my baby queer roots.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. I can't discount how much that movie is like a part of me. In fact, I'm in my pod closet now and I have a picture up on my wall of my best friend in high school who still my best friend, but she showed that movie to me for the first time. I had never seen it before. And she and we got all dressed up in like lingerie and she had all of these like garter belts and corsets and stuff. And we like got all dressed up after watching it the first time and did like a photo shoot. And like, you know, that's somebody I've had a lot of gay experiences with as well early on. And so, yeah, it's just like, and so, yeah, it's like just something I see in my closet like every single day. And I don't think I think about it that directly that often, but like, wow, that was so much a part of me figuring myself out. And I can't imagine, again, discourse that people are having that is anti-Rocky Horror. And I'm like, this is such a deeply joyful, freeing, liberating movie.
Oh my God, absolutely. Yeah. So we have to talk about David Cronenberg.
Yes, get back to Cronenberg. I think after, you know, if Rocky Horror was like my youth entrance into sexual horror, David Cronenberg was like my adult, very intense, like, holy shit, I didn't know you could do this in a movie kind of filmmaker. Shivers, Videodrome, Crash, of course, but not really a horror movie. But I think, yeah, Shivers and Videodrome definitely were very impactful to me.
Yeah, it's his early films like Shivers and Rabid are like these early progenitors of erotic horror films. And I think that what David Cronenberg does so well in his body horror films is the disgust and the attraction, and, you know, body parts become other body parts, wounds become genitals, everything is mushed together.
Well, everything can be fucked. You know, everything can be sexualized and eroticized on the body, which I think is pretty revolutionary thinking. There's a quote in Shivers that I love so much when, you know, everyone's being taken over by these parasites that make them hypersexual. And one of the women says, he tells me that everything is erotic, that everything is sexual, that even dying is an act of eroticism, that talking is sexual, that breathing is sexual, that to even physically exist is sexual. Like, ooh, call me a parasite, baby. I agree.
Yeah, and that is kind of the essence of erotic horror, right? I mean, that's why David Cronenberg
definitely
is
the
one
thesis of his work.
Right.
You know?
It's David Cronenberg is one of the fathers, like Jean Rollin and Jess Franco of erotic horror. It's the way that he blends the two together so that violence and sexuality become indistinguishable from each other, that sex and fucking become death and murder and disease and destruction. And
well, and I think it's really interesting that like you and I talk about that, and like clearly we're getting horny and hornier as we're talking, and we're like, yes, absolutely, like that's such a core tenet of our own sexualities, I think, and something we bonded over as friends. And then the conservative fascists can kind of take that idea and use it as a reason why there shouldn't be sex and we shouldn't have access to cultural materials that utilize sex in this way, and how it's like damaging to people. And we're like, yeah, it's damaging. Yeah, give me more of the damage, you know? And it's so interesting. I mean, obviously it's dangerous and scary the way that it's twisted. That's a given. But I also do think it's interesting that like the flip in people's heads. And I honestly believe that everyone sees this as sexual. It's just that some people it scares them in a way that they can't explore, and other people it scares them in a way that they are like longing. They let themselves explore and they let themselves enjoy it. But I don't think it's actually giving a different reaction to people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I often wonder like what people who aren't perverts think about these films, and I think that that everybody can see the connection between the erotic and the violence in a Cronenberg film, and I think that's what's so special about his work, that even if you aren't like a nasty pervert, I mean, you can watch it and understand what his thesis is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can either choose to be like, oh no, this hits you in a way that it's too scary and you don't want to think about it anymore. Or it hits you in a way where you're like, yeah, I'm scared and I'm wet and I want I do want to explore this further.
Yeah.
That's the pervert line.
That's the pervert line. So I also thought we could talk about Paul Morrissey.
Oh my gosh. I love Frankenstein and Dracula films with Andy Warhol.
And he just died. So I feel like it's important to talk a little bit about Paul Morrissey as a person. So he directed these 2 erotic horror films, Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula. He directed many other films, but these were like his erotic horror films, and they're usually talked about in the canon of erotic horror, and I believe are really important to add to our canon of erotic horror. He was a controversial figure, writing in the New York Times in 1995 about an upcoming retrospective. William Grimes says, of the many peculiar characters who drifted in and out of Andy Warhol's factory, the filmmaker Paul Morrissey may deserve the grand prize as the oddest specimen of all. As the auteur responsible for such films as Flesh, Trash, and Heat, he did more than anyone to create the image of the Warhol world as a nonstop festival of sleaze, drugs, and moral squalor. Yet Mr. Morrissey can sound like a rock-ribbed Republican. I chose to find story material in people who led idiotic lives doing their own thing, Mr. Morrissey said. I was making fun of people who accepted the hippie life of sex and drugs and rock and roll. So a lot of Paul Morrissey's films were actually mocking that lifestyle, but ended up, kind of
promoting it.
And we watch them now and we're like, it almost seems like an advertisement for it. But
absolutely. Wait, I've never really looked into him further. I had no idea that was.
Oh yeah, he was kind of an asshole. Yeah.
That's hysterical. I don't understand how you can make such a sexy film then. Like, these films are hot.
Well, and even with something like Flesh for Frankenstein, he said about this movie, I don't really think it matters whether a film is photographed to look fantastic or whether it looks really awful. If you come away from the film and you have a somewhat amusing time, you've seen something that approaches a good film. I've always made anti-erotic comedies. Sex is the best subject for comedy because it's so silly. I ridicule it because people try to use it as some sort of cure-all. I ridicule violence because it's another sacred cow today. So in Flesh for Frankenstein, he's also ridiculing the pretensions of like historical period dramas and the romantic myths of genius, whether artistic or scientific. He's using the costume genre to push his he's imposing his like personal concerns of powerful heroes failing to achieve a full sense of self because they have too much power or freedom, and sexual exploitation and its failure remain these dominant themes in both these movies. Andy Warhol was attached to Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula, but it was strictly a commercial ploy. He had nothing to do with the films. He actually just, if anything, he came on set to Flesh for Frankenstein once during the editing process and was like, looks great, and left.
Oh, wow. I thought he was like financially, I thought he was like way more a part of them.
No, yeah, it was mostly just to market the films that he was attached to them.
Oh, nice.
And Morrissey had a lot of contempt for Andy Warhol. Like like they worked together, but he was always kind of making fun of him. Like he talked about him as a presence, some kind of figure in my consciousness. He never really, I think, existed. Andy was a very timid, flimsy character, a person I had to tell what to do and who really needed someone to guide him, even to speak for him. I was totally controlling all the films, the one thing the factory was really famous for. So
wow, that doesn't totally surprise me.
Yeah, I mean, he's a Paul Morrissey like is a complicated figure. He was very conservative. A lot of the erotic horror that we see in Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula are actually about the about sexual excess and how and its failures.
Right. That went over my head and I just went, hell yeah, sexual excess. I love this.
So here's a quote from the writer Brontes Purnell in Interview Magazine, who wrote about Paul Morrissey.
Interview Magazine, Andy Warhol's magazine.
Exactly. Morrissey is a hard person to place in the Warhol pantheon, and his legacy is marred by a number of refusals. According to the film critic Sam Weisberg, he is an unapologetic conservative and devout Catholic who hated hippies, the sexually liberated, drug users, and rock music enthusiasts. And while this scorn undoubtedly contributed to Morrissey's resentment of the factory in general, he feels Warhol took too much credit for his work. The director's own legacy is not without contradictions. A clean religious boy who spent his time around degenerates. I've seen the biggest freaks of my generation turn alt-right in front of my eyes, usually out of spite or more likely boredom. Maybe Morrissey is the earliest example of how too much time in outlying incubators can breed contempt. But in a world where leftist politics can start to feel like church camp, we shouldn't throw the baby away with the bathwater. In this case, one who devotes his life to cleanliness also devotes his life to dirt. Morrissey became a revolutionary filmmaker, directing a dozen Warhol films chronicling the life of mid-century deviants, and what a chronicle it was. He was one of the first directors to actually cast trans women in movies, not to mention the outrageous displays of sex and full frontal nudity he put on screen. So I think that's a really great point that Brontes Purnell makes. It's like, if you devote your life to cleanliness, you're also devoting it to dirt. So he's devoting his career to like the downfall of sexual decadence, and in doing so made like two of the most sexually decadent films to ever exist.
And encouraged perverts, for
exactly.
Sure. Yeah, I like that a lot. Well, then you have to kind of think like, does the lady protest too much, like
totally,
because if you really don't like it, I don't know, you're spending an awful lot of time there.
Yeah, you don't like it, but you're spending an awful lot of time playing around in the dirt with us.
Yeah, like, why aren't you going and making Westerns? Like, what's stopping you from spending time with John Wayne?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like he was so concerned with it that he ends up making like two of the most erotic horror films to exist, starring Udo Kier, who's gorgeous in them.
Right.
I feel like we also need to talk about Clive Barker, who obviously directed Hellraiser and Nightbreed, and didn't direct Candyman. That's directed by Bernard Rose, but he wrote the story. And these are all very erotic horror films. So
I think what's interesting about them is like being, growing up as a film kid in the 90s and seeing, there were these icons of horror movies that everybody would dress up as for Halloween, right? The Freddy and Jason and Michael and Chucky. But then Pinhead from Hellraiser would be a part of that, and Candyman also. And, before I had seen any of these movies, I thought of them all sort of like these equal sort of horror movie monsters, and the sexuality that's in Clive Barker's films. Obviously, he's a gay artist, author. They're so different from the other films that were kind of thought to be in that same league for like young millennials.
Yeah, it's so funny because Hellraiser, we talked about this when I did my episode on Hellraiser with Tina Horn, but a Pinhead is often like put in the category of these other slashers like Michael Myers or Jason from Friday the 13th. And you would see Pinhead masks around Halloween with all of those slasher guys. But then you actually watch the movie and you're like, this is something completely different.
Mm-hmm. And just the idea of like a little kid dressed up as Pinhead is so funny too.
Totally. Yeah. And again, like I have a huge 2-part episode on Hellraiser if you want to hear more about.
So good. Yeah. I re-listened to it this summer and I sent it to my patrons as well because we read Hellbound Heart for our June book club read, and I had never actually read Hellbound Heart before, and I was blown away by how much hornier it is than the movie, which I still love, but I was like, damn, this is one of the most erotic books I've ever read.
Yeah, it's super erotic, and Hellraiser obviously couldn't, because of censorship and all of those things, it couldn't be as erotic as the novel, but it still manages to have these very erotic themes of, again, the disgust and the attraction, which I keep saying over and over again in this episode, but
the sadomasochism aspect of it, and the idea that like intensive pain, that there's pleasure in pain and torture, which is a pretty taboo perspective for a mainstream film.
Something like Candyman also is about that.
You have a great episode on Candyman too.
Yeah, with Nay Beaver.
Yeah, it's really good. That made me look at that movie in a whole new way.
Yeah, this is a movie that's also very erotic, and there's that push and pull between violence and sexuality. And Candyman, it's even more so, is this legacy of racial violence and the taboo erotic, the taboo erotics of the interracial relationship in America. And that's very much a horror. It's a horrific thing, kind of horrific history, and to explore the erotics of that horrific history is like very taboo and controversial. And I think that's something that we've kind of neglected to talk about in this episode, is that I think a really important part of erotic horror is the taboo and the controversial, obviously.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because that's what kink is. Like, that's what people enjoy when, this kind of thing is being litigated online. It is upsetting. That's what an aspect of things being fun or intriguing or compelling, obsessive is like, you're not supposed to want to do certain things or be attracted to certain things or talk about certain things. And like, there is titillation and thrill in diving into the dark where you're told you're not allowed to go.
Absolutely. Playing around in the muck, and that fear again, that titillation of fear, and oh my God, should I really be doing this? And cinema is a place where you can do that safely, right? You can explore these really taboo and controversial topics, these taboo, controversial sexual topics, in a really safe, contained environment that's like happening internally for you while you're watching it on the screen.
Yeah, and can provoke conversations with friends and partners, and can be like a doorway to exploration in a way that says like, oh, this is okay because it's not completely forbidden. If something's not talked about or acknowledged at all, and you can't see any aspect of what you are curious about anywhere, there's like a forbiddenness that can turn dangerous. And like, to see even a little bit of something explored on the screen means that you could explore it in your life as well, which I think is like a necessary and very healthy, and not actually denigrating or bad for society.
I feel like there's so many other things that we could talk about. Like, we could talk about erotic cannibalism films like Trouble Every Day or Der Fan or Raw, and we could talk about lesbian vampire films, which I've covered so much on this podcast and in my screenings.
I will say Daughters of Darkness is definitely one of my top 10 like hottest, most erotic movies ever.
Daughters of Darkness is definitely one of the top erotic horror films of all time. I also have an episode on that. And there's a Japanese filmmaker, Hisayasu Sato, who is an exploitation filmmaker who worked really prolifically in the Pinku Aigu genre. And if you haven't heard of him, definitely check him out. Also a really important erotic horror filmmaker. And then, of course, a director like Abel Ferrara, I think also has to be kind of mentioned, or, something like The Addiction or Driller Killer. There's a lot of eroticism in those films, and even in something like Miss 45. But I want us to get
a great Halloween scene in it.
Yes, absolutely. But I want us to get to the state of contemporary erotic horror. And
yes,
can we think of any good erotic horror films from the last 15 years? I thought of like 3.
There's 2 that I really love that I wrote down. I really love The Untamed from 2016.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
And I really love Knife and Heart from 2018.
Oh yeah, Knife plus Heart. That's Jan Gonzalez, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And I thought of Amer from 2010, directed by Helene Catet and Bruno Forzani.
Oh, I don't think I've seen that one.
Oh, I think you'd really like it. And Raw and Titan by Julia Dussarno, which I think are both
definitely
very erotic. But the state of erotic horror is not great.
No, I mean, Amer's from 2010, Untamed 2016, Knife plus Heart 2018. Titan's the newest one, and what is that, 2 or 3 years old now? Like, we're not getting multiple movies a year anymore. And a lot of the movies we're dealing with when they have to deal with sex is maybe mentioned, or there's like kissing that cuts away, or the sex is all it's violence, like the ghost is a metaphor for rape. Like there's not a lot of like enjoyable sexuality in horror films. Like I'm completely at my limit with like exploring Me Too through horror or trauma through horror.
I'm done. Enough.
I mean, I was done years ago, but I'm like done now. Like, yeah. I don't want to hear it. I don't think anyone has anything interesting to say about it. And it feels like a switcheroo. Like I'm going to something for like a ghost story. And then it's like, oh, is it that your family's abusive? Okay.
Everything's about trauma.
Right, which like a lot of horror was already exploring that without making it so explicit. That's what I think that's like the state of modern horror filmmaking right now that's so exhausting. And I would extend that to maybe all of cinema, is everyone feels like things need to be said so clearly, when so much of, I don't know, the enjoyable thing about film analysis and film criticism is reading into what's going on at the time and how the culture that the filmmaker and writers are stewing in affects the story that's being told. How about you just tell the story you want to be told, and whatever is happening right now will come through in your work. Like, let it just come through. Stop forcing it so hard. Everything has to be drawn with such a clear, big red marker. And I feel like we're all being babied.
Well, that was one of my biggest problems with The Substance, actually, was the heavy-handedness of it. And I feel like this really does not lend itself to eroticism, because part of the erotic is when it's shrouded in a kind of mystery.
Yes, I was just going to say that, imagination.
Yeah.
And that's what, even the pre-code films where you can see a little bit of sexiness is like a lot of reading into it. The Corman Poe films are kind of sexy if you like read into it. And yeah, you're not going to see the lesbian vampires like fully eating each other out, but like that's there, there's right. Like lots of implications. And, people will say like, oh, today's audiences, they don't have the patience, or everybody needs things spelled out for them. And I don't think people do actually need that. I think culture has a responsibility to guide the thoughts of the public. Like, why don't we make more challenging film and see if it will guide people, not assuming that why would people be dumber unless we're making them dumber? Like that, there's a responsibility to the tastemakers to actually like intellectualize the viewer.
Yeah, we're just in a very sexless moment in our culture, and there's this idea of the erotic as like frivolous,
Mm-hmm.
And like
I think comedy falls into that as well. Like we're also in a really bad time for comedy, which is my
yes.
like entire life. It's what I make money teaching and working in. And like, yeah, the fact that people don't make any effort to make big budget comedies anymore, because also a big part of comedies, like sex comedies were like an entire genre for decades, and like we're also losing that as well. And I think there's a little bit of like, I love horror comedy is like my favorite genre, and like that's so difficult for people to figure out how to make. And I think it's because we're in like a very humorless time as well as a very sexless time. And I don't understand how this happened because every time has been bad. I know everybody wants to obsess over now being the worst time period, but that's just ahistorical. Like
no, everything is always bad.
Right. So like why now are people so it's like a lack of imagination, there's like a hopelessness, there's a nihilism, and it's all sort of working together to give us some of the blandest, least inspired art I've ever seen.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a huge backlash because of Me Too and people not knowing how to reckon with sexuality and eroticism because there have been years and years of sexual exploitation and violence, and people not knowing how to. I mean, a lot of these movies we're talking about explore sexual violence through the lens of the erotic, which is also very taboo. And people are afraid to talk about that. There's this idea that's like, oh, rape is not about sex, it's about power, which, is a really important feminist maxim. And I feel like that's been taken in art to this almost extreme point where, people's sexual fantasies do involve violence and things that are not palatable to talk about. And people are afraid to talk about lest they be accused of
promotion
or perpetuating that.
There's this idea that all art is some type of activism, or it's exactly what the filmmaker or actors think, or there's no room for fantasy, right? We're like really obsessed with the documentarianism of everything, like logic. The way I hear people talk about like, this didn't make sense, I didn't understand this, why wasn't this explained? No one can appreciate like an ambiguous ending.
I know. Can you imagine some people like that watching like a genre land film? Like nothing's ever explained in those movies.
It's just like so surreal. And yes, no, exactly. That's what I crave. I find myself watching so much 70s horror the last few years and kind of just obsessing over it and being so bored with like the more recent stuff that's coming out, and just, I don't know, having like a general disinterest in a lot of newer things because I don't want a message. Because I've done it. I went to school, I paid for it. I'm a feminist. Like, I don't need filmmakers who I don't think have even really studied feminism to like show me films about what it's like being a woman and how hard it is. Like, bitch, I get it. That's not why I watch films.
Did you see Red Rooms?
No, I'm really curious about it. Did you watch it?
Yeah, I thought it was excellent. I thought it was one of the best movies of the year. And
it looked really scary.
Yeah, I wouldn't exactly call that like an erotic horror film, but it definitely deals with like the erotics of violence. And the main character is a woman who's like living in almost like an isolated kind of sexless existence, who finds what could be considered almost a sexual satisfaction in the exploration of like snuff. And I'm still like mulling over it, but yeah, I really love that movie.
That's interesting. Well, see, and I was looking back through our list of the sexual films we have liked, sexy horror films from the last 15 years, and they're all international films.
Yes.
Nothing on our list has been an American film, which is disheartening.
Yeah. It's bad over here.
Yeah, it's really rough. And I think you're right that there is a lot of reckoning with Me Too. And I think that is why we see younger generation, we're both millennials. And I think we do see a younger generation having a little more backlash around sex because they came of age hearing about all these public stories, like reading stories on the internet of like really terrible sexual exploitation and violence. And I could see that being very scary to kids. Like I didn't grow up hearing like, oh, guess what? All of your favorite comedians and actors and directors have all hurt the people in the work that you like. I can see how that does a number on your psyche. I'm going to need people to move beyond that.
And we're talking about like a generation that grew up on the internet, like being sexually exploited by adults on the internet. And
yes, yeah, exactly. Having parents putting cameras in their face nonstop and telling them to like entertain. I mean, even if it's not sexual, there's a sexual element there's an exploitation element to that. And like, yeah, there's no boundaries for young people on the internet. Like,
and there's so much like sexual panic. Like I saw a screenshot from a TikTok, which is like a thing on Twitter.
Horrible sentence to have to say.
I saw a screenshot from a TikTok that was like a woman talking about how she worked in the oncology ward, and there would be a guy that would come in to get blowjobs from his wife who was dying of cancer. And people were like, wow, this is so awful. Like, all of the horror, the reactions of horror. And then I saw someone retweet it that was like, in 20 years, we'll look back on things like this as the same thing as like boomer email chains. Like, and that's not real. That didn't happen.
No.
And
no, exactly.
I feel like it's, I mean, it could have, like what do I know? But
it's definitely designed to get, I mean, that's the kind of thing that is so horrific. Yes. It gets you like, I mean, a lot of these people, they're rage farming because they actually make money on TikTok from like clicks and comments.
Rage farming, exactly.
Why would you not think of the worst thing that you could say? And we are,
and it happens to involve sexuality.
Exactly. So, I mean, I could say, I manage Videotex, one of the last remaining independent video stores thriving here in the country. And like, I could say, oh my God, I walked in on a man jerking off in our erotic film section. And this is like the 6th time this has happened to me. And we can't even have erotic films because men come all over them, or like I've talked to friends who have worked at porn stores before. This is my 5th store that I've worked at that's had, porn or erotic films, and I'm used to working with it. I like working with pornography. I'm comfortable around it. And if anything, working at video stores is what got me interested in and accepting of porn and sex work in general. So I've had friends be like, oh, is everything all stuck together? Is everything covered in cum? And I'm like, what stories? Like, no, people who rent porn are regular people. They come into the store, they pick stuff out, they hand it to you. And like, sometimes they're bashful or they don't really want to talk. And like, but if you work in retail at all, or, work with film at all, I've dealt with some real assholes and perverts and psychos who just are renting regular films. I've dealt with some of the worst people in my life who are just only watch like French films, So it's very easy. I could get on TikTok and be like, oh my God, our whole erotic film section had jizz on it when I walked in today. And then that could turn into like a huge thing. And then I'd make like probably $100,000 off of it. Like, we have to think about how some of our perspectives are being shaped by people who are making money off of our horror, our rage, our conservative leaning viewpoints. Like, yes. Some of this is not much different from Fox News. They're taking the framework of what these giant
it's conservative radical feminism
companies. Yes, they're taking that and now they're using it on TikTok, and they're using the framework of TikTok so it doesn't look as aesthetically unpleasing as Fox News. But how is it any different just because like a young person with like lip filler is saying it,
Yeah, and it's like this very disturbing trend of like people going back to like rad femme turfism, the rise of all of these things. And the rise of this like conservative strain of anti-porn feminism, and which has always been around and never went away, but I see it very clearly in rage bait like that. And in, you know, even the way that people talk about films, and the way that people talk about rape scenes in films, and the way that people talk about sex scenes in films. And it's very, very
I think it's really disturbing.
It's very disturbing. It's very like anti-art, anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, it's infantilizing to women and queer people.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's so much of it comes from like this poor person is being victimized, when so much of the time the writer who's positing this, the speaker, hasn't talked to the people involved, doesn't know anything about whatever lifestyle or, film, piece of art. They haven't engaged in it in any way. They just see something they don't like. They have a knee-jerk reaction, and they perhaps are able to put together a point that's well written, but not well reasoned, but written in a way that captures people's imaginations. And it's just so frustrating. It's so infantilizing, and people will just read something that hits them emotionally. And I'm like, you're not even talking to the people that this is affecting. Like, the people who are mad about Lolita haven't read Lolita, haven't talked to an English professor, haven't talked to anybody who even likes the book. And they're like, well, here's why it's definitely bad and wrong. We cannot live in this culture where people, like, everyone's so scared about Trump getting elected and like impending fascism, but we are already extending fascism every single day and retweeting it. We're fine with it. We're like, well, here's why we shouldn't have sex in films. Here's why we shouldn't have pornography. I mean, we're doing the work for them. I mean, this is what, when people say kill the cop in your head first. This is what we're talking about. I don't know. I find, it's interesting we're talking about Roland's work with, like, I love exploring nostalgia and aging and this horror of death and growing older. And I know you don't like X, but that's one of the things I love about that film, is I do think it explores the horror of aging in a really interesting way. And like, I am not scared of that ever. But what I hate about aging is the way I see it affecting everybody else, and not in a physical way. That seems to be what everyone's so scared of. We all have to like change our faces and bodies so much, but nobody is like working on their fucking minds, which are rotting. And like watching the best minds of my generation turn into like, yeah, boomers perpetuating like rumors, or people who all of a sudden are like anti-drug, anti-sex, anti-porn, when I'm like, we did coke at an orgy together. What are we talking about? Like, why is that? People are aging in like this really distressing way in their minds that like super freaks me out. I feel like I'm the last one standing at a party.
Totally. I mean, that's like what Hunter S. Thompson said. He was like, the last like few decades are going to look like a party compared to what's going to happen post 9/11. And
wow,
that's, kind of, yeah, that, I mean, even the way I see people talking about drugs on the internet, they're like,
exactly,
coke is bad for you. It's like, yeah, no kidding.
Like, right. Why are we moralizing everything though? Like,
it's all bad for you.
Yeah.
That's why it's fun.
Right. Yes. But so are lots of things, the way that lots of the ways that people do things are bad for them. People have no problems reading articles about how you should stay up all the time and only sleep 4 hours to get, the most productive work done.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, maybe living in the city and like choking down car fumes isn't good for you. But like, I mean, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Like, why are we so obsessed with what's good? What does this even mean? What is good?
The like wellness craze of today. I mean, and everybody's getting so skinny and like...
And it's just, for what?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I have sex with all kinds of different people of genders, backgrounds, classes, body types. And I have had a lot of sex with straight men, and I don't know, maybe it's just the guys that I'm interested in, who are actually usually much smaller than me, are not interested in like rail thin women.
But that's like the dominant, I mean, I think I think that there's like a whole world of people that you and I just aren't exposed to.
I guess, but like, what? I think we only know like the actual fun people. So who cares about? That's how I am obsessed with Love Is Blind, is like my one reality TV show that
I am
cannot
too.
get enough of. And every time I watch that, I'm like, is this dominant thought? Like,
no, those people are mainstream.
Like, straight people think about stuff, because like when they're like, well, you know, once you get married you can't talk to women anymore.
That's like actually that's mainstream
can't
thought.
Text your ex. And I was like, this is so obnoxious. These people could never handle being gay for one day. No. Or like, you had sex with your friends. And I'm like, I'm hard pressed to think of a friend I haven't had sex with, or at least want to have sex with.
Yeah.
Like the day before my wedding, I was sitting at a table with like 6 of my friends, and I realized I'd had some type of sexual encounter with all of them. And I was like, this is really nice. I feel surrounded by like love and care.
Yeah,
I can't imagine demonizing that.
But that's the dominant ideology, and that's, you know, and it's pretty, I just think we're living in like a whole different milieu than what the mainstream ideology is.
But it doesn't help that like nobody is trying to push our milieu to the mainstream. You know, I like being in the underground. Obviously, these are our people, and we can't be around Love Is Blind type people because they're sick. Well, in a non-fun way. But like, if our work became more mainstream, I mean, there's something to affecting the culture. You know, it's really interesting to think about some of these films having been popular. Hammer films were so popular.
Yes.
You know, like they completely shaped the direction of horror. They got people interested in horror again with like so much eroticism and lesbian vampires. And like it, I mean, there's like 20 years of extraordinarily like blockbustery horror films that had endless like
boobs.
Taboo sex in them.
Yeah.
And people love that. I mean, we can, I don't know. I don't think it has to be like this. People have to like take a chance though. You know, and we have to stop being like, well, this is what people want and this is where the culture is. It's like making art for the culture. That's not how it works. Like the culture follows the art. I mean, that's how it should be.
Yeah.
But I think if we put all this power into corporations, right now corporations run everything and everybody is so obsessed with being, you know, totally validated by corporations. I mean, I live in LA, I work in LA. That's what I see all the time, is like people not caring about each other's work until Netflix has bought it, Shudder has bought it, you know, they're on deadline. And it's like, I need money. I need people to pay me for my work. Absolutely. But I don't need Netflix to tell me my work is good. I don't need Apple to tell me my work is good. I know it's good. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. We try to make stuff so companies will buy it and then they'll propagate it. I don't know. There has to be a different way. It just makes me very frustrated.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Anyway, how are we fixing this today on this podcast?
Make the horny movies you wish to see in the world.
Yeah, exactly. I just wrote a fingering scene into my newest script because I was like, this movie isn't sexy enough.
Yeah, I mean,
I think we'll be opening with fingering, my favorite thing.
My dream is to bring back the erotic thriller. So
yes, and you and I have been talking about that a lot throughout our friendship. So I'm hoping we'll get to make something together. That's my greatest goal.
That would be amazing.
To make an erotic thriller with you.
I would love that. So we're gonna fix it. And
we're fixing it right here, right now. This is the start. Mark our words.
Thank you so much, Luce. Where can people find you on social media?
Thank you for having me. Yes, I am on Twitter and Instagram at LTB Comedy. That's where you can see everything that I'm up to. I teach and coach improv and stand up here in Los Angeles, and I perform sketch and stand up and improv here. So a lot of my time is comedy. And then when I'm not doing that, I'm working on my podcast. It's Always Halloween, year-round Halloween history and storytelling podcast that you can follow on Instagram at It's Always Halloween Podcast. I also have a Patreon where we do films and a book club, and we have a Discord similar to yours, but as I said, mine is in the more like cozy, historical, traditional sense, not as much sexiness, although I'm there, so I'm bringing the sexiness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's probably everything. I also have a queer DIY film collective, Too Much Productions, and my newest film, Surprise, has been doing festivals, and it's a satire on toxic girl boss positivity, all about women murdering each other to climb to the top.
Fun. And you know where to find me. Girls Guts Giallo on Instagram, Girls Guts Giallo X on X/Twitter, and sign up for my Patreon, patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. If you want more of me, I have screenings, I have bonus episodes, I have a book club, I have a Discord. I'm always on there producing the dreaded word content. I hate that word, but
I hate it. No, it's art. It's all art, Annie.
Buy my content.
You're an educator. You're an educator, historian, an expert, an artist.
Thank you.
Not a content maker.
Please support Luce and I. We do this full time. We're like full-time working artists. And we really rely on your patronage. So
absolutely. And we're patrons of each other's pages. So we really believe in each other's work.
Money back and forth.
That's what all queer people do, I'm convinced. We're like, here's your $25 and I'm gonna need that back next month for my thing.
This has been wonderful. Thanks so much, Luce.
Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about more horniness in the future.